Margaret Thatcher has died at the age of 83. She reportedly died of cardiac arrest in her headquarters in Lincolnshire, England.
Welcome to Good Night with George Galloway here on the Malacca Red channel on YouTube, where more than 1/3 people over the last few months have listened and watched these podcasts on issues as varied as love, Che Guevara, and the war on Gaza and British politics and so on. So please spread the word. We want to reach 1 million viewers in the next 12 months. Tonight I'm going to talk to you about Britain, a state of collusion. The immediate cause for that is this gigantic 2-volume report by the Right Honourable Sir Desmond de Silva QC, the report of the Patrick Finucane Review. But of course, Britain's collusion with illegality, with terrorism, with illegitimacy of all kinds, goes back a lot further than 1989, when the Belfast solicitor Patrick Finucane was cruelly murdered in front of his wife and 3 small children. His wife was also wounded in the attack by a so-called loyalist terrorist gang, acting, it turns out, from the report very directly on the orders of elements of the British state. I'll come in more detail to the Patrick Finucane case in just a minute. The peg for this is that I have organised a meeting in the Houses of Parliament on the 28th of January at 7:30 p.m. in Committee Room 14 under the same title, Britain, a state of collusion. I put a question mark after that title because of course some may come to argue the opposite case. The hall, the room, holds around 150, 170 people, so places are strictly limited. You can check out the events page on Facebook that we've set out under the same title, and you can register there, or you could write to me at Parliament at gallowayg@parliament.uk in order to reserve a place. But you will have to pre-register because far more people in London and beyond will want to attend the meeting. The subjects that will be under discussion at the meeting are the very subjects that I'm going to talk about tonight. Of course, British collusion in murder, skullduggery of all kinds is as old as empire itself. But there is no doubt that the British state underwent a brutalising, coarsening era under the hated leadership of Margaret Thatcher. And many of the episodes that we'll discuss tonight and in the public meeting deal with her period, which is not to say either that they started with her or that they finished with her. They very definitely did not in each case. But there are 3 celebrated cases which we'll concentrate on in the meeting and in this broadcast tonight. There's Orgreave and the overarching conspiracy, to borrow a phrase which was absent according to De Silva in the Finucane case. The overarching issue of the great miners' struggle of 1984-85 is summed up by the conspiracy against the miners at Orgreave. The second is the Hillsborough disaster. in which 96 football fans were not just killed, but then slandered by the state, slandered by the media, and blamed for their own demise. A studied insult against the people of Liverpool, against the deceased, and against their families. And the third is the murder of Patrick Finucane. I lived every day of the great miners' strike of 1984-85. There was hardly an hour in those days that I was not thinking of how I could play my part in coming to the defence of the mining communities in Britain, the defence of their jobs, the defence of the society which they had built up over more than a century and a half of coal mining in Britain. I was already an honorary member of the National Union of Mine Workers at the time that the strike began. The South Wales area, Mardy Lodge to be precise, in the Rhondda Valley. I had long been associated with the Miners' Union, particularly its legendary leading figure, Michael Magahey, a Scottish communist, who taught me a lot and who took me under his wing and who regularly put me on platforms at miners' day schools, weekend schools, conferences, and so on. May God have mercy upon his soul. So when the strike broke out, when the Miners' Union, hundreds of thousands strong, decided to act, to strike before Mrs. Thatcher was able, piece by piece, salami style, to destroy their industry, closing pit after pit after pit, devastating the communities on the grounds of accountancy, not realizing it would appear that accountancy and economics are two different things. I was right into the breach. I was organising meetings, rallies, collections, trying to get financial support to the miners. I was active as an agitator, an organiser, a propagandist. I was, with every beat of my heart, with the miners in their great struggle. If you want to know more about that miners' strike, there's no better book than that by my comrade Seamus Milne of The Guardian, called The Enemy Within. If you want to just look at a picture, a movie, well, you can look at Billy Elliot or other films about that period which dealt with the miners' strike. Brassed Off was another terrific one to catch the flavour, the atmosphere of that strike. It divided Britain very definitely between those who stood with organised labour, those who stood with the mining communities, and those who either refused to stand with them or positively stood against them. There were many heroes and there were many villains in that piece. The Labour leadership of Neil Kinnock, a man who had himself come from mining stock in South Wales, betrayed the miners in a vindictive way, blaming the miners' leaders for a confrontation which Mrs. Thatcher, as the Prime Minister, had deliberately provoked, blaming this tactic or that speech as being the reason why he and Labour could not wholeheartedly come to the side of the miners, even though the miners had stood with Labour for 100 years. It is a miserable story in that the miners were defeated, and now coal mining effectively doesn't exist in Britain. Now the National Union of Mine Workers, once the brigade of guards of the British Labour movement, was smashed. They were forced, after 12 long, bitter, hungry months, to go back to work without a settlement and subject to systematic victimisation, blacklisting and destruction. And now those mining communities are sunk, by and large, in misery, mass unemployment, poverty, lack of social cohesion, antisocial behaviour, problems of drunkenness and drugs and crime. and it's a pitiful sight to behold, and it all could have been avoided. Because if the miners had been supported, and if the miners had been victorious, Thatcher would have been no more, and the partial destruction of trade unionism in Britain, which followed the defeat of the miners, would never have happened, and every working person in Britain would have been better off as a result. But at Orgreave, which came to epitomise Mrs. Thatcher's mobilisation of all the resources of the state to destroy the miners, to defeat their strike, to drive them to defeat, what happened to Orgreave was systematically that the British state, moving paramilitary and police resources, confronted the miners day after day at the Orgreave coking plant, which became a decisive, pivotal battleground, literally battleground, in the great miners' struggle. And what was worse was that with their collaborators in the media, Mrs. Thatcher was able to turn the miners at Orgreave from victims into villains. Footage, news footage, was actually reversed. I mean that. Actually reversed. Appearing to show the miners attacking the police, when in fact the police were attacking, oftentimes on horseback, the miners. It looked like a scene from another country. Looked at today, it looks like a scene, as it is, from another age. The miners' gallantry, bravery, honour, dignity was systematically trampled underfoot. And miners went to prison when in fact they should have been given a medal by the British state and the British public for the stand that they were making in defence of productivity, of the mining of real wealth. Britain in that era was systematically destroyed as a manufacturing and extraction economy. Mrs. Thatcher laid waste to British manufacturing. 30% of our manufacturing capacity was systematically, deliberately destroyed. Mrs. Thatcher destroyed more British plant and equipment and machinery and capacity than the Luftwaffe had managed to do during the Great Blitz on this country in the Second World War. Justice for the miners, justice for the sacked miners, the jailed miners, the miners whose society, whose community was destroyed, has been a cause in my heart for a very long time. And now that more and more evidence is beginning to emerge about the role of the British state in these great events in the Thatcher era, we've decided to showcase Orgreave as a case study in the perfidy of the British capitalist state. Under Thatcher, yes, but it hasn't finished yet. At Hillsborough, in the same era, 96 Liverpool supporters were crushed to death at the Hillsborough Stadium in Sheffield at a football match. They were crushed and trampled to death because of the incompetence, the venality of the police and other organisers. It ought to have been regarded at the time as a great mark of shame upon the police in South Yorkshire. It ought to have been an occasion on which the British state got down on its knees and begged forgiveness from the great city of Liverpool, but instead it was transformed into an attack on Liverpool, as if Liverpool were a city that they caricatured as a city of drunks and thieves. According to the Sun, the gutter Sun, the lowest form of journalistic life owned by Rupert Murdoch, edited at the time by a gutter snipe, a dirty, lying, filthy gutter snipe called Kelvin Mackenzie, still to be cited from time to time on serious British television programmes. The son accused, in the days after this massacre of the innocents, accused the supporters themselves and their fellow Liverpudlians of having caused the disaster, alleging that they were drunks, that they picked each other's pockets as they fell and died, that they urinated on the dead. It was one of the most disgusting episodes in British media history. But worse, even worse, was that the South Yorkshire police then embarked upon a systematic falsification of events, altering hundreds of witness statements, concealing evidence, destroying evidence, suppressing evidence, so that the verdict could fit the facts that they wanted people to believe, namely that the Liverpool supporters were responsible for this tragedy themselves, when in truth they were the victims of it. For 23 years, the families of these Liverpool supporters campaigned. They must have oftentimes thought that they were beating their heads against a brick wall. But finally, just this very year, justice for the fans and their families was obtained, and the Hillsborough report was published. It was as comprehensive and damning an indictment of the actions of people that we were entitled to expect to uphold the law, people that we paid to keep order and to uphold the law, as it's possible to imagine, and the reverberations are still being worked through. Some of the policemen involved may well be prosecuted. Others have been driven from office, screaming and kicking. And I played a small part in that, with the Chief Constable of West Yorkshire being forced from his position under fire from campaigners, from sections of the media, and from me and others in Parliament, with questions, speeches and motions on the order paper of the House of Commons. The third episode on which we'll concentrate is this one. In a way, though it represented the death of only one man, though it was just one example of the dirty war that the British state has fought in Ireland for centuries, in a way, just like Orgreave, it encapsulates everything that was wrong and disreputable and dishonourable about British rule in the occupied north of Ireland. As some of you know, I come myself from an Irish background. The struggle of the Irish people for freedom and unity and independence is one that is very dear to me. I knew Patrick Finucane. I have come to know members of his family and his friends very well. And I, by chance, am involved in his case in a very intimate way. In the committee room corridor of the British House of Commons in early 1989, I was on some obscure parliamentary committee which was dealing with an obscure piece of legislation now laughably forgotten, which would require elected councillors in the north of Ireland to take oaths of allegiance to the state. It was one of the many puerile efforts by the Thatcher government at the time to try and hold back the rising tide of national consciousness amongst the nationalist community in the north of Ireland. Just like the banning of Gerry Adams from speaking on television, the suppression of important documentaries by landmark documentary makers like Panorama and others. It was puerile, it was pitiful, it's not worth dwelling on. But in the course of the committee's progression, the then minister, Douglas Hogg, you'll remember him. He's the one you paid to clear his moat, the moat around his castle in which he was living. You, the taxpayer, paid for Douglas Hogg's moat to be cleared. He left Parliament in ignominy. But that day he was in his pomp, and apropos nothing, totally gratuitously, he made the following statement: that some solicitors in what he called Northern Ireland were rather too close to their clients, rather too close to the IRA. That very day, on that committee room floor, I grabbed him and said, "You have just signed the death warrant of solicitors in the north of Ireland, officers of the courts of your own country." He blanched, he went pale, and he hurried past me. But I dare say he had cause to remember what I said just 4 weeks later, when at Sunday lunch with his wife and 3 small children, Pat Finucane was murdered. 2 so-called loyalist killers, one of them an employee of the British state security apparatus, burst into his house, wounded his wife, and killed Patrick Finucane with 14 bullets in front of his 3 small children sitting at the luncheon table. An officer of the court, a solicitor, was murdered because he had carried out his professional duties as a lawyer only too well, using the British state's own laws regularly to defeat them in the courtrooms and to expose them for the lying, colluding hypocrites that they were, and I would argue still are. Because of my involvement, my clash with Hogg that day, and because of the peculiar horror as the father of young children myself, of a father being murdered in front of his children and his wife, this case never left my heart. And so when David Cameron, in the most shameful prime ministerial statement from the dispatch box, since Chamberlain's hapless confession of the failure of the Norway invasion in the great Norway debate at the beginning of the Second World War, which led to the fall of the Chamberlain administration and the assumption of power of Mr. Churchill, I believe that Cameron's statement to the House in December of 2012 was the most shameful statement any Prime Minister had to make to the House of Commons since the Norway debate, more than 60 years before. It was shameful in that it was full of shame. It was shameful because, I may be wrong here, but it seemed to me that the Prime Minister was genuinely ashamed. And sincerely, he apologised to the Finucane family on behalf of the government and indeed the country. But what he didn't do was order a public inquiry into these events that was independent and that could give us the truth that we need and we deserve to have. How far up did this conspiracy to murder Pat Finucane go? Who briefed Douglas Hogg to make the statement that he made, which signed the death warrant of Patrick Finucane and others in the north of Ireland? Who knew that our own security services told the loyalist terrorists to murder Pat Finucane? That's now accepted by De Silva in this report. He was chosen as a target for murder by the British state. So who took that decision? On whose behalf? Who knew about it? What did they know? And when did they know it? And who will face justice for this? Who will be prosecuted for it? Which political heads will roll? After all, Chamberlain let his own head roll because of his shameful admissions at the dispatch box. Is no one to pay the price for this? De Silva clears Douglas Hogg. How? I really don't know. Hogg said what he said, and 4 weeks later, Patrick Finucane's solicitor was murdered. Rosemary Nelson was murdered. Solicitors being murdered in Britain, and with the state's involvement and collusion. It doesn't get much more serious than that. If it happened in El Salvador under some grisly gold-toothed generalissimo dictatorship, well, most of us would not be surprised. But many of you would be surprised if you read this case. It is said by De Silva in this report that more than 75% of the intelligence given to the loyalist murder gangs was given to them by the British state, by the special branch in the north of Ireland, the special branch of the now defunct Royal Ulster Constabulary, and by MI5, answerable to the Home Secretary, in turn answerable to the British Parliament. Now, the British Parliament hasn't made much of a job of holding MI5 to account, but I'm determined in this campaign that on this Finucane case and on the others of Hillsborough and Orgreave and others, deaths in custody and many other examples, that the British state is held to account. Not because I hate the country in which I was born, not because I hate the people amongst whom I live, but just the opposite. The British people deserve better than this. Britain should have a state and a government that it can have confidence in, that it can believe is better than that. For after all, if we're ruled and governed by criminals, murderers and colluders in crime and murder, what hope for the rest of us? We talk about gun crime and knife crime and mugging and petty crime on the streets by criminals. But what if the criminals are actually in the government? What if the criminals are actually in the police force? What if the criminals are actually in the intelligence services? Because all of that emerges from De Silva. A wholly inadequate report, one which is the beginning and not the end, but one which is as damning as it is heavy. We will not rest. We in respect will not rest until Britain is no longer a state of collusion. Remember the date again, Monday the 28th of January 2013 at 7:30 p.m. in Committee Room 14 of the House of Commons. But you must pre-register either at our Facebook events page called Britain a State of Collusion, ? Or through my parliamentary office at gallowaygg@parliament.uk. I've been George Galloway. This has been Good Night with George Galloway, and you have been a marvellous audience.
Finucane's picture still looks down on the Falls Road, a reminder of one of the darkest moments of Britain's war against the IRA. Mr. Finucane was a lawyer who frequently defended Republicans against terror charges. He became unpopular with the government.
A government minister called Douglas Hogg stood up and said that there were solicitors or lawyers in Belfast who were unduly sympathetic to the IRA.
3 weeks later, Pat Finucane was shot 12 times in front of his wife and 3 children. Even the senior police officer who attended the scene now believes the gunmen were aided by elements of the British state.
I find it quite shocking, and it goes beyond everything I ever believed in Britain. And all the time I'm standing at a scene and dealing with the aftermath of this investigation, and all the time there had been state collusion in it.
Some of the Ulster Defence Association paramilitaries who were involved had security force links. Ken Barrett, who admitted the killing, became a special branch informant soon after. William Stobie supplied the guns. He was a special branch informant at the time. And Brian Nelson, who supplied the targeting information, was an army intelligence agent. Pat Finucane's family wanted a public inquiry. Sir Desmond de Silva's report is merely a review of evidence, and the family are sceptical.
Mr. Cameron did admit that collusion happened, and he did say it was important to find out how high up the chain of command that it went. But in truth, I don't think they want that chain of command to be exposed.
Sir Desmond de Silva has now written to Pat Finucane's family, telling them he has not shied away from probing the depths of this case or from drawing hard-hitting conclusions. But tomorrow, Pat Finucane's family will decide whether he has been hard-hitting enough. Carl Dinnan, ITV News, Belfast.
Arthur Scargill called for a mass picket of Orgreave. Today he got one. Several thousand miners turned up, an attempt once and for all to halt British Steel's coke convoys. Mr. Scargill himself was there, trying to direct operations with a loud hailer. But so too were the police, in numbers rarely seen, even in this dispute. The pickets were penned in away from the front entrance, but when the first convoy was spotted at around 9 o'clock, the trouble began. The pickets surged and running fights broke out. Missiles were thrown and fencing ripped up. But when the smoke bombs went off, the reinforcements and the riot shields moved in. And all the while, the lorries, 35 of them, swept in procession into the plant. The injuries were to both pickets and police, the victims taken away to waiting ambulances. An hour and 20 minutes later, the newly laden lorries left for Scunthorpe, their drivers well protected in their cabs. This time, the miners, helpless behind the police cordon, stood and watched in almost total silence. This afternoon, another convoy and more clashes as police drove back pickets, and again running battles between miners and mounted police. There were more injuries. Ambulance men wore special headgear as they led casualties away from the scene. There are clearly two conflicting views of who is to blame for the trouble.
We've had riot shields, we've had riot gear, we've had police on horseback charging into our people, we've had people hit by truncheons, we've had people kicked onto the ground by the police, and the intimidation and the brutality that's been displayed are something reminiscent of a Latin American police state.
But tonight, police put on display some of the weapons they say were used against them and their horses.
There's talk about riot shields and riot helmets. That simply is protection for the officers who've got to stand there. If the officers were unable to stand there, the gates to the plant would be closed. And simply, in order to maintain that position, we had to bring out shields and we had to don protective helmets.
One thing, though, is certain. The lorries did get through, and with the drivers saying they'll continue the coke runs, further confrontations appear inevitable.